Mark Fenton was a 34-year-old financial consultant who prided himself on living a quiet, orderly life in the leafy suburbs of Greenfield Heights. He worked from home most days, enjoying the view of trimmed hedges and calm streets just beyond his front window. Until recently, his biggest annoyance was an overenthusiastic paperboy who sometimes tossed the morning news onto Mark's prized geraniums. Everything changed the day his neighbor Karen Johansson moved into the house across the street. She was in her mid-40s, wore pastel suits that matched the color of her Lexus, and carried herself with an air of relentless entitlement. At first, Mark found her merely amusing. She complained about birds chirping too loudly at dawn and tried to introduce fines for anyone who dared leave a trash bin out for more than 5 minutes after collection. But then her brazenness took a turn that veered from annoying to downright criminal. She had been in the neighborhood for less than a month when Mark noticed odd gaps in his mail deliveries. Packages from online retailers went missing, and he received fewer letters than usual. Initially, he chalked it up to mishaps at the post office. However, the real culprit became clear one Wednesday morning when he observed a silhouette skulking around his mailbox. From the living room window, he glimpsed Karen's familiar figure, hair pinned back in its usual style, rummaging through his mail slot as though it were a personal shopping spree. Mark froze, struggling to believe his own eyes. By the time he rushed outside, she was gone, leaving behind an open mailbox devoid of the cards and letters he expected. At that moment, he wondered if perhaps she'd simply taken mail by mistake. After all, how could someone be brazen enough to just steal another person's correspondence in broad daylight? Although troubled, he decided to extend the benefit of the doubt. People make errors. Yet the following day brought no relief. A package he had been eagerly anticipating vanished before he could retrieve it. He checked the tracking number, marked delivered, at 10 a.m. Mark had been at his desk the entire morning, yet no knock came at the door. The only explanation was that Karen had swooped in again, especially since her pastel Lexus had been spotted passing by his driveway at precisely 10:05. Mark felt a ripple of anger and disbelief. Curiosity propelled him to watch her house more closely, and that's when he saw the bright blue Amazon envelope, identical to the ones he usually received, on Karen's porch. It was more than a coincidence. He tried to handle the situation calmly. That afternoon, he crossed the street, heart thumping, determined to remain polite. Karen opened the door, greeting him with a wide, artificial smile that seemed to say, "I dare you to accuse me of something." Mark cleared his throat and mentioned the lost packages, gently insinuating they might have been delivered to her address by mistake. Karen's response was a masterclass in condescending indignation. She feigned shock, fluttered her lashes, and insisted that no such mail ever arrived at her doorstep. She even had the gall to suggest that Mark be more mindful of his own deliveries. It ended with her shutting the door in his face after proclaiming, "Some of us don't have time to deal with such nonsense." Over the next few days, Mark's attempts at direct confrontation led nowhere. He rang her bell, hoping perhaps they could check the delivered items together and see if, by chance, the courier service had mislabeled the addresses. Karen dismissed him at every turn, hinting that she might report him for harassment if he persisted. Meanwhile, more letters and small parcels kept disappearing. Mark started receiving cryptic notifications about credit card applications he never initiated. Late one night, as he combed through email warnings from various banks, the pieces came together in a horrifying realization. Karen wasn't merely stealing his mail, she was trying to open a credit card using his stolen information. The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. The neighbor who seemed fixated on tidy lawns and noise complaints was committing identity fraud right under his nose. He wanted proof before taking legal steps. So, he installed discreet security cameras around the porch and mailbox. Each morning, he woke up determined to catch her in the act. And catch her he did. The grainy footage showed Karen's well-manicured hand slipping into his mailbox at 7:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, deftly lifting a stack of envelopes. Mark's stomach twisted with a blend of anger and triumph. He had the evidence, but he also wanted to see how far Karen would go if she believed she was still undetected. Cautiously, he waited, uncertain whether to confront her again or proceed directly to law enforcement. Yet, part of him itched for a plan that would truly teach her the lesson she deserved, a plan more satisfying than merely handing over some video to the authorities. He pondered all possible outcomes. If he called the police straight away, there would be an investigation, which might stop her immediate threat. But Karen, slippery as she was, could spin the situation to her advantage. He had seen how she operated, pretending victimhood, using tearful theatrics to mask her wrongdoing. Mark wanted to ensure she couldn't wriggle free with some sob story. More than that, he yearned for a moment where Karen would stand exposed in all her brazen hypocrisy, where her mask of respectability would crumble in front of everyone who ever believed her prattle about civic standards. And so, with cautious deliberation, he hatched a meticulous plan that balanced legality with a level of poetic justice. He began by ordering a few items online, nothing costly, just random knickknacks. He timed the deliveries to coincide with the hours Karen typically lurked. He also enlisted the help of a friend in the local bank, someone he trusted, to track any suspicious credit activity under his name. Over the span of a week, he watched Karen become more daring, collecting parcels left in his mailbox, sometimes even reaching over his fence to grab them. This gave him plenty of fresh footage. Her eyes darted left and right, but never up, where a tiny camera captured every incriminating motion. With each stolen piece of mail, she grew bolder, fueling her illusion that she was winning some personal war against Mark. Meanwhile, Mark resisted the urge to pound on her door. He wanted her self-assured. He wanted her to feel invincible, right up until the trap snapped shut. Increasingly, Karen's escapades strayed beyond mail theft. One evening, Mark discovered that she'd tried applying for a platinum rewards card under his name. He found the relevant email alerts right after dinner, and his pulse pounded with raw anger as he read the lines, "Your application is being processed." That was it. He realized he had enough to ruin her if he played his hand right. But how to ensure a downfall so public, so dramatic, that she'd never be able to show her face in the neighborhood again? He decided to stage a confrontation in front of the local HOA meeting, where Karen loved to flaunt her status as if she ran the entire district. The night before the meeting, Mark barely slept, his mind spinning with the final steps. While he prepared digital copies of the surveillance videos, bank alerts, and suspicious credit card attempts, he also coordinated with a local police officer, a high school friend turned detective. They planned a discreet presence at the upcoming HOA gathering. Mark's heart hammered with anticipation, convinced that the next 24 hours would seal Karen's fate for good. The following evening was warm and humid, but that didn't deter the residents of Greenfield Heights from attending the monthly HOA meeting in droves. They filled the community center's multipurpose room, which was lit by fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly pale. Typically, these gatherings discussed lawn regulations, parking violations, and the occasional stray cat issue. This time, however, Mark had orchestrated a scenario to make it far more memorable. Karen arrived in her trademark pastel suit, wearing that smug expression. She chatted with a small circle of neighbors, complaining about petty things. Apparently, someone's barbecue smoke had drifted into her yard last weekend. She thrived on such trifles, but tonight's news would be anything but trivial. Mark stood off to one side, quietly conversing with Detective Randall Stevens, the old friend who'd agreed to observe. Randall wore plainclothes to keep it low-key. The plan was simple: Mark would call Karen out on her spree of theft and fraud. Randall would intervene if Karen tried to leave, and only then would the real evidence come to light in front of everyone. Mark's stomach fluttered with nerves. This was bigger than any public speech he had given. He was about to blow the lid off her duplicity in a crowd she actively manipulated. But the time for caution had passed. If he let her go on, who knew how many other credit cards she'd open under his name or how many neighbors she'd victimize? The meeting began as usual. An older gentleman droned on about new guidelines for trash disposal. Karen tossed in remarks, praising the new rules for keeping the neighborhood pristine. Nobody questioned the irony. She often demanded the strictest regulations for trivial matters yet felt no qualms about violating federal laws. Mark tried to appear calm, waiting for the perfect moment. Finally, the topic of suspicious activity in the neighborhood came up, prompted by a different resident who mentioned missing mail. That was Mark's cue. With a steady breath, he raised his hand and requested to speak. He stepped forward, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Karen. In a measured tone, he explained that over the last month, multiple pieces of his personal mail had been stolen and that there was video evidence of the thief. Karen looked mildly curious at first, maybe even a bit bored, until Mark noted that the footage clearly identified the culprit. At that, her eyes narrowed. The room hushed, tension rising. He then moved to the second half of his revelation, mentioning the fraudulent credit card applications in his name. A wave of murmur spread across the attendees. Karen's shoulders stiffened. Mark opened a laptop and projected stills from his surveillance footage, images of Karen leaning into his mailbox, rifling through letters, and tucking away envelopes. Gasps sounded throughout the hall. Karen's lips parted in indignation, and she rushed to her feet, stammering denials. But Mark didn't stop. He displayed the email confirmations from the bank, the attempts at opening accounts using his personal details, each traceable back to Karen's address. She turned crimson, or at least as much as the fluorescent lighting allowed, struggling to form a coherent explanation. She fired off lines about a misunderstanding and delivered to the wrong house, but the evidence was too explicit. The neighbors, once so wary of her sharp tongue, saw the raw proof of her deceit. Nobody bought her excuses. Detective Stevens took a step forward. Karen saw him and froze, her face twisting with panic. She flung out an arm, as though physically trying to push away the reality of the situation. Mark could practically hear her mind whirring, searching for a new angle. But even her biggest skill, feigning victimhood, was failing her now. The hush in the room was thick, broken only by uneasy shuffles of feet and a stray cough. A pair of board members exchanged looks that said everything, the jig was up. In a final, desperate move, Karen began lobbing accusations at Mark, calling him a privacy invader for installing cameras and an obsessive creep for monitoring her. But Mark calmly reminded everyone that it's completely legal to have security cameras on one's own property. He also pointed out how suspicious it was for her to be near his mailbox at all, given that it stood well within his property line. It was like a perfectly laid trap, and she had stepped right into it time after time. When Karen tried to slip out of the meeting hall, Randall blocked her path. He flashed his badge just enough for her to realize it was real. The entire room watched, some in stunned silence, others in a mix of horror and grim satisfaction. As she looked around, seeing no allies, her bravado cracked. It was a moment Mark had long fantasized about, Karen Johansson, deflated and cornered, her grand illusions shattered in front of all those she once lorded over. He stepped back, letting the detective handle the immediate questioning. She flailed with more excuses. Someone framed me, the mail was already open when I found it, pathetic flares of denial. But there was too much evidence to the contrary. Her story was about as convincing as a $2 knockoff handbag. In the chaos that followed, the room erupted into pockets of chatter. Some neighbors clumped together, discussing her nerve, others stared slack-jawed at the still images of Karen rummaging through the mail. Mark felt a swirl of relief, vindication, and, oddly, a flicker of pity. It was downright embarrassing for her, but she had brought this on herself. Randall calmly insisted that Karen follow him outside for a word. The board members, along with a few bold residents, trailed behind like spectators at a dramatic theater performance. The glare of a street lamp revealed Karen's face in all its contorted fury and fear. That was when Randall quietly informed her that she might face charges, including mail theft, a federal offense, plus attempted credit card fraud. He let her squirm for a moment as she fumbled to explain herself. "This is all one huge misunderstanding," she sputtered. "I never meant to open those cards, it was a clerical error. Mark's mail must have been mixed in with mine. I only tried to help sort it out." Randall cut her off, pointing to the camera footage on Mark's phone, which showed repeated theft, not a single accidental pickup. She turned a dangerous shade of pale, shifting tactics, blaming the mail carrier for constantly messing up addresses. Nobody believed a word of it. By then, Mark had joined the cluster outside. He watched as Karen's frustration mounted, culminating in a high-pitched explosion of curses directed at him. She accused him of orchestrating a trap. She shrieked that he was ruining her life for petty reasons. Mark simply stood there, letting her hurl insults while the onlookers quietly judged her. Nobody intervened to defend her. She was alone in her meltdown, an outcast who had overplayed her hand. The board president, a mild-mannered woman named Marjorie, finally stepped forward. She told Karen that the HOA would hold a special hearing to review her conduct and rule violations. She had effectively broken multiple neighborhood policies, not just moral codes. If found guilty, she could face steep fines or even forced removal from the community. Karen's jaw nearly hit the pavement. The idea that her revered social standing in Greenfield Heights might vanish overnight sent her into a fresh spiral of hysterics. On top of potential criminal charges, losing her place in the neighborhood's social structure was an unthinkable blow to her grand self-image. Karen tried one last Hail Mary. She called out to a couple of neighbors, people she once dominated with her imperious attitude, pleading for them to vouch for her. But they stared at the ground, arms folded. Some averted their eyes altogether. She had spent months berating them over trivial matters like lawn ornaments or the angle of their parked cars. Now, when she needed their support, they were more than happy to see her toppled from her pedestal. After all, Mark wasn't the only one who'd endured her petty tyranny. She had a track record of making life miserable for nearly everyone around her. The difference was that Mark had the patience and know-how to catch her red-handed. With no sympathy or allies left, Karen retreated to her Lexus, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of rescue. Detective Stevens reiterated that he'd be in touch about the next steps. She slammed the car door and started the engine, but even then, her dignity was in tatters. As she sped away, the onlookers scattered, returning indoors or heading home to discuss the evening's events in hushed, astonished tones. The aftermath of that disastrous HOA meeting spread through Greenfield Heights like a shockwave. News traveled quickly. It seemed every conversation by the mailboxes or in the aisles of the local grocery store revolved around Karen's spectacular downfall. People swapped stories of her relentless nagging, her petty demands, and her sharp-tongued criticisms. Now, with undeniable proof of her crimes, the entire neighborhood felt almost celebratory. It was as if a long-standing tyrant had finally been dethroned. Mark, for the most part, chose to keep his head down, not wanting to stoke the gossip further. He had no intention of gloating openly, it wasn't his style. Yet inside, he couldn't deny a sense of triumph. Karen had tormented him, tried to steal his identity, and now she was on the brink of a well-deserved reckoning. Later that week, he got a call from Detective Stevens, who confirmed that the police department was reviewing all the evidence to determine the charges. Stevens sounded confident that Karen would, at the very least, face stiff legal consequences for mail theft and attempted credit fraud. Mark thanked him and hung up, feeling an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. He also received updates from the credit card companies, confirming they'd flagged the fraudulent attempts. This meant any direct damage to his credit was minimal. Relief washed over him, a major crisis had been averted. But the fallout continued to intensify. Karen's bank accounts were frozen pending investigations, her credit score plummeted as various institutions became aware of her unscrupulous activities. The rumor mill hinted that she might be facing thousands of dollars in legal fees. She had prided herself on her curated image, an upper-middle-class woman with impeccable manners and refined taste. That self-constructed facade was now in ruins. Mark heard from a neighbor that she'd been spotted leaving her house uncharacteristically disheveled, wearing an old hoodie, as she tried to avoid prying eyes. Adding to her misery, the HOA board scheduled a special session to rule on her membership status and the potential expulsion from the association. Normally, HOA boards handled minor infractions, like leaving Christmas lights up past January. But Karen's case was extraordinary. She had subverted the sense of trust and civility the neighborhood relied on. Mark received a formal invitation to speak at that meeting, though he felt somewhat ambivalent. Did he want to see her squirm again in a public forum? A part of him argued that she deserved every ounce of humiliation, another part reminded him that the matter was almost closed. Still, he decided to attend, hoping for a final resolution. On the evening of the special session, the atmosphere in the community center was thick with anticipation. Neighbors who rarely showed up to monthly gatherings now packed the rows, eager for the dramatic showdown. Karen arrived late, wearing dark sunglasses indoors. She slipped into a seat at the back, presumably wanting to avoid direct eye contact with anyone. When her turn came to address the board, she approached the microphone with a trembling hand. Gone was the imperious flair, replaced by shaky words of apology. She attempted a half-hearted defense, babbling about misunderstandings and momentary lapses in judgment. She even tried sprinkling in some tears for sympathy. But nobody was buying it. The board members, typically mild, had turned fierce. They questioned Karen about the repeated thefts, referencing the incontrovertible proof. They inquired about the fraudulent credit card attempts. Each question struck like a hammer. Karen tried to deflect blame onto non-existent, mail delivery errors once more. At one point, she broke down, claiming Mark had orchestrated a witch hunt. That triggered a ripple of exasperated laughter. People were beyond fed up with her spin. The hush that followed was almost suffocating. Then, in a unanimous decision, the board declared that her membership was revoked and that she'd face hefty fines for her transgressions. She was effectively persona non grata in Greenfield Heights. A stunned silence enveloped the room. The final blow was delivered. The board recommended she leave the community altogether. It wasn't a formal eviction, but it was clear that living in a place where everyone despised her was no longer viable. Eyes burning with tears, she hurried out of the meeting, leaving behind a wave of murmurs and pointed stares. Mark watched her vanish out the door. A swirl of satisfaction and pity enveloped him, but satisfaction reigned. Over the next few weeks, Karen's life continued to unravel. Legal notices arrived at her door, likely a combination of the pending criminal case and private suits from credit card companies. She rarely ventured outside during daylight, presumably to avoid the neighborly glares and the occasional reporter who got wind of the story. Mark carried on with his routines, feeling freer than he had in months. His mail returned to normal, a steady trickle of bank statements, work documents, and the occasional letter from friends. He installed an official lockable mailbox, just to be safe. It gave him a sense of closure. The neighborhood, freed from Karen's constant meddling, seemed lighter. People chatted more casually, no longer worried about who might report them for trivial rule breaks. The final meltdown came on a hot, still Saturday afternoon. Mark had just stepped outside to tend to his garden when he noticed a large moving truck backing into Karen's driveway. He paused, curious. Over the next hour, Karen, looking disheveled and furious, helped movers pack boxes into the truck. Pieces of expensive furniture and gaudy decor were hauled out. Passers-by paused to watch, some even snapping discreet photos. Karen's composure was in tatters. She barked at the movers to be careful with her possessions, but her once commanding tone now sounded hollow. She saw Mark watching from across the street. Their eyes met, and for a moment, he caught a glimpse of utter defeat in her gaze. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Then, with the last box loaded, she climbed into her Lexus and followed the truck out of Greenfield Heights without so much as a wave goodbye. The quiet that settled in after her departure was almost surreal. The local chat forums buzzed with news that Karen Johansson had abandoned her place. Some speculated she sold it at a loss, others said the bank might foreclose if her legal bills piled up. Whatever the details, it was clear her life in Greenfield Heights was over. Mark exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders dissipate. The woman who tried to rob him of both his mail and his identity had been taken down, not by violence, but by her own hubris and his careful planning. He returned to his garden, wearing a subtle grin as he watered tomato plants that no longer had to share space with a neighbor's relentless malice. Weeks later, Mark found himself reflecting on the entire ordeal, from the first stolen letter to the final spectacle of Karen's forced exit. It still felt a bit surreal that someone could stoop so low, risking prison time to rummage through another person's mail. But then, Karen's arrogance had always overshadowed any sense of caution. Yet for all the chaos she caused, Mark realized he'd emerged stronger, more vigilant, and appreciative of the supportive neighbors who quietly backed him. He'd learned the potency of calm, calculated action in the face of outrageous provocation. He also appreciated the unspoken camaraderie that formed among the residents after Karen's downfall. Previously, neighbors had been cautious around each other, fearful that any small misstep would be reported to the HOA by that hawk-like figure across the street. Now, they organized block parties, some even joking that they could finally leave a recycling bin out 10 minutes too long without being written up. Mark found himself chatting more with people on his block, forging friendships in the warm glow of collective relief. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the community felt more united than ever. As for Karen, word had it that she was ensnared in legal battles, possibly relocating to an apartment in a nearby city while she awaited the results of her case. Rumors trickled back that she complained bitterly about Mark, the HOA, and even the Postal Service, but no one took her ranting seriously anymore. She was, in essence, a disgraced figure. Some said it was a fitting end for someone who had built her life on illusions of grandeur while trampling over everyone else's rights. Meanwhile, Mark resumed his comfortable routine of early morning jogs, quiet afternoons managing his client portfolios, and tranquil evenings with a good book. The mailbox remained secure, no more missing packages or suspicious bank alerts. He still remembered the adrenaline surge when he first caught her on camera, the righteous fury that pulsed through him knowing she'd tried to steal his identity. Now that it was all in the past, he could afford a wry smile at the memory. He felt no remorse for orchestrating her public humiliation. If anything, it served as an important reminder that bullies eventually face consequences, especially when people stand up to them with patience and proof. Greenfield Heights never forgot the scandal. Occasionally, Mark overheard new residents ask about the male thief, almost disbelieving such an incident could happen in a neighborhood so ordinary. The older tenants laughed and relayed the legend, embellishing it with comedic twists, like Karen creeping around at midnight in a ski mask, or forging half the town's signatures. It became a cautionary tale: if you cross certain lines, especially messing with someone else's identity, expect a dramatic downfall. Over time, Karen's name turned into a local punchline. Don't pull a Karen now, people joked whenever petty drama emerged. While she had once tried to dominate the community with her petty, oppressive tactics, her memory now only served as a lesson in humility. Sometimes, Mark revisited the security footage to remind himself that, yes, it all really happened. He watched Karen's gloved hand rummage through his envelopes, the arrogance in her posture as though she was entitled to anything she touched. It still sparked anger, but also a perverse sense of amusement. She had underestimated him, presumed he would be too meek or unsuspecting to fight back. She'd assumed no one in a polite, suburban environment would stoop to collecting evidence and cornering her in public. Ironically, it was precisely Mark's mild nature that had let him operate under her radar long enough to gather an ironclad case. Looking back, he was grateful he had chosen a route that was both legal and undeniably thorough. Had he rushed to confront her after the first theft, she might have found a way to twist the story and paint him as an aggressor. Instead, she dug her own grave. The meeting, the footage, the credit alerts, they all came together like puzzle pieces. By the time she realized she was trapped, it was far too late. Mark decided that approach was a testament to the old adage, give someone enough rope, and they'll hang themselves. The last major update Mark received arrived months after Karen's dramatic exit. A formal letter from a federal court indicated that charges of mail theft were upheld. She avoided jail time through a plea deal but faced substantial penalties and years of probation. There were restitution requirements, too, though Mark doubted she'd pay them willingly. Still, the letter's dry legal language glowed with a sense of moral victory. Everything Karen had tried to get, money, credit, a facade of respectability, had backfired spectacularly. The justice system, slow but methodical, had taken its course. In the neighborhood, life continued calmly. Mark's day-to-day existence settled back into its pleasant rhythm. He discovered new hobbies, tinkering with a small herb garden, volunteering at the local animal shelter, and occasionally hosting neighbors for barbecues, where the smoke now drifted in any direction it pleased without fear of complaint. It struck him that people tended to appreciate their freedoms more deeply once they'd survived a brush with someone determined to stifle those freedoms. Karen had, in a roundabout way, taught everyone what it felt like to lose trust and how crucial it was to stand up for oneself. On a breezy autumn afternoon, Mark found himself strolling along the sidewalk where Karen once parked her pastel Lexus. A for sale sign, slightly crooked, still sat on the unmowed lawn. The property had lingered on the market for ages, no doubt hindered by the lurid stories attached to it. Eventually, the sign would come down, replaced by a new family with no knowledge of the drama that once simmered there. Mark pictured a kid collecting mail from that mailbox with innocent excitement, unaware that it had been ground zero for a grand suburban scandal. The thought made him smile. Life moved on. And so, the saga of Karen Johansson ended as abruptly as it began. She had arrived like a storm, thrashing against the quiet norms of Greenfield Heights, only to vanish in disgrace when faced with the consequences of her own recklessness. Mark's perseverance, aided by a cool-headed approach, ensured that justice prevailed, and the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. In the end, Karen stole mail, attempted fraud, and tried to bully her way to victory. But she never accounted for her target's resolve, or the resilience of a community that, when pushed too far, united to protect what was right. The final lesson was one she refused to learn: no one, not even a self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, is above the law or beyond accountability.